Ooh, assumptions are causing you miscommunications, misunderstandings, inaccurate judgment, conflict escalation. So that's what we're going to talk about today, because your assumptions, consciously or subconsciously, are creating so many issues for you. And when you can understand it, then you can start addressing it, right? So that's what we're going to talk about. Let's not have assumptions. Check it out. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Positivity Experience. It's your girl, Lori, and man, I am excited. Fall is upon us, and I am over the moon. Fall is like my favorite time of the year, preferably October, November, December, but I will take the September as well. So it really amps me up. It's, you know how people go through like spring cleaning. I'm more of like a fall cleaning kind of girl. It just does something totally for my mental health, and I love every bit of it. But today we're going to talk about assumptions, and over on Patreon, there's one of the assumptions that's in this that is called cognitive laziness, which is the opposite of critical thinking. Right? So think critical thinking. The opposite of critical thinking is cognitive laziness. That's literally what it's called. And so I've decided over on Patreon to continue the conversation about these assumptions, but specifically within the cognitive laziness, because it deserves its own podcast, because there's a lot that comes with that. And so if that's something that interests you, and it comes with a little worksheet that it does every week, comes with a worksheet, you can join me over on patreon.com/the positivity experience, or wherever you're getting this podcast right now. If you go into the show notes, which is the description, you'll see at the bottom where it says become a Patreon. So yes, originally I usually try to just, compliment it, but that deserves its own podcast, and it'll help make you more aware of why you're making assumptions. And it's just so funny because this was on tap for today. And I just had a conversation with somebody today about a subconscious assumption that they made. And I just pointed it out in a like a teachable kind of way. So it's just funny that is today's podcast. But yeah, so I want to talk to you a little bit about it because, assumptions are going to be very, very harmful in many, many ways. And we're going to talk about that here. It can lead to, misunderstandings, misjudgments, definitely strained relationships. And so today we're going to talk about 10 characteristics of it, but there are more. But I want you to understand, like, assumptions can go hand in hand with expectations, because you assume something, you will now expect something. Again, some of this is subconscious and some of it is very conscious. But I want to talk to you about the negatives to it, and kind of from there, I'll talk to you kind of why we kind of have it, or maybe I'll do it the other way around. And so let's go into that, because when you can prevent yourself from assuming, positive or negative, by the way, not just negative, it can be positive. Don't just assume the positive of somebody's actions and reactions. So I want to talk to you about it. Now, first of all, why do we make assumptions? Well, we make assumptions because of simplification. Now, our brains are very, very smart things, but they're also very programmable. So the things that our brain believes, it's going to believe what we feed it. That's just how the brain works. It doesn't differentiate and go, well, now that's not true. Like, it doesn't differentiate. So we have to do that. So our brains strive in general to simplify any complex information. That's just how your human brain works. We're like, oh God, that's a lot. Let me simplify it, right? And so, it makes it easier for us to process. So when you assume that you can serve that as a mental shortcut, which, by the way, assumptions are absolute cognitive laziness, which we're going to talk about. But yeah, and it allows you to fill in sort of that gap to understand it. So you try to simplify it. You assume something because if it takes a lot of the complexity to try to understand it and research it, it's easier for you to just simplify. So sometimes we'll make assumptions based on our simplification. Now, what does that lead to? Well, that can lead to misjudgments and misunderstandings like crazy, right? Because assuming that you understand anyone's thoughts or intentions is already going to be problematic. Oh no, you are not in their brain. I don't care historically how they've behaved. You are not them. And this simplification for you of going, well, yeah, this is just how they've always been. Well, yeah, because historically okay, yeah, you might say that might be more favorable outcome. However, this can lead to such misjudgment and misunderstanding Because if you're not clarifying, it's going to lead to all kinds of miscommunications and anger and hurt feelings, because what you perceive might not align with what their actual message is. Like sometimes you see somebody's behavior and then you go down that assumption rabbit hole of like, oh, well, then this must be how they feel. First of all, feelings and thoughts aren't facts, and they're very individualized to each person. So no, you don't know how somebody feels because you didn't ask. You assumed that you knew what they were going to say. You assumed that you knew how it was going to be. Now, mind you, this isn't just in like relationships. This is, I guess everything in life is a relationship, but like work and various things in your life. So when you just assume that somebody says no, okay, you know how no is my favorite word, is a boundary, is a one word boundary is no. And if somebody says no, and then you assume that you know that they said no based on the fact that they must be mad at you or they must feel some kind of way. You are making an assumption, and that is not going to benefit you. You have no right to assume that you know how somebody thinks, feels, or acts. Because now if they show you, historically, if they show you that this is going to be typically how they respond, then kind of know that going into it. But don't just assume that that's going to be the outcome. And if you're going to go into anything with an assumption, it's going to create problems. Well, I guess I'm not going to go on this date because, God, I met him on Tinder. Like that can't go well. Well, you just already assumed that all that was going to go well. You already fed life into that, right? So you got to be careful of your assumptions because they will lead to misunderstandings, miscommunication, and misjudgment. Now, going into that historical stuff, that's called pattern recognition, right? So our assumptions are influenced by our past experiences and interactions with people, places, and things. So you assume that somebody's going to behave a certain way, but you're just going to start filling all of those missing pieces based on a pattern that you've encountered in the past or that you've encountered with that person. So if you're going to give that person an option, let's say somebody's wronged you or somebody's done something to you and you decide you're going to give them another chance. Well, if you're already looking for a pattern, you will find that pattern. That's a cognitive bias. You're going to find what you're seeking, right? So in that pattern recognition, yeah, we are recognized as a human being to recognize patterns. That's how we program our brain. But just because somebody does something that is familiar with what somebody said or did in the past doesn't mean that they have the same intentions. And again, going back to that first one, you don't want to have a misjudgment in that, right? Because now you're going to make an inaccurate judgment based on a pattern recognition, right? So when you're leading to an inaccurate judgment about anybody's characteristics, their capabilities, their motives, it's going to influence your decision and actions, and it's going to affect that relationship and opportunity, any opportunity, right? So if you see a pattern with something, now you can say, for sure, you can say, hey, you know what? I'm seeing a pattern here, right? We have to recognize patterns. If something negative keeps happening, well, we got to make a decision. So if you go, okay, I'm starting to date this new person, or I'm starting to talk to this new person, become friends with this new person, and they're displaying a lot of similar patterns to the past that does not make me feel warm and fuzzy. Well, you don't assume that they're going to do the same thing. However, if you're seeing patterns and you're recognizing a pattern, don't just assume that it's going to be bad or good and say, okay, maybe this isn't something that I'm willing to maybe take a chance on, and that's okay because your body and your mind is going to recognize these patterns on pattern recognition. But again, don't just assume that somebody's going to do something, but you can say, this doesn't feel good to me. That's trusting your intuition. This doesn't feel good to me. I'm seeing a pattern here. Don't yell at the person. Don't become aggressive to the person. Don't become defensive. Just make decisions based on some pattern recognition, but don't assume that you know how they're feeling just because it's a similar pattern. Because you and I can do the exact same things and have very different intentions. We could both have very malevolent, intentions, or we can have benevolent intentions, but we could both want the same thing, but have different intentions behind it, which determines if it's manipulative or not, right? And so you get to make that decision, but understand that you're also making assumptions based on that pattern recognition, which again goes into past experiences, right? So when you have past experiences, your assumptions are like highly attached to these sort of experiences. And you're going to assume that everybody's going to behave in a certain way because similar experiences and pattern recognition has proven so. Now you can't do that because now you are saying, I know that what I see is true. And we're going to talk about that in a minute because what you see is not true. Just because you see something that is similar to a past experience doesn't mean it's the same as your past experience. So this is where you have to get warm, and fuzzy with the unknown. Yes, you got to take some kind of chances and risks because my goodness, you will have no human interaction whatsoever if you're always focusing on your assumptions. I assume this date's going to go good. Great. But now things go good. And now you're like, I'm assuming that the bottom's going to fall out because it always does in the past. Well, you're always going to see it that way. Right. So you have to be really, really careful of that. So a lot of times when you have those past experiences, it can lead to conflict escalation. I know some of you don't like conflict, but sometimes, you can assume that if somebody else's perspective is a certain way based on some past experiences, you're assuming that you already know what their perspective is without verifying it. Okay. You're going to attribute any kind of negative intentions. I know your intentions. Do you? Did I tell you my intentions? No, but I know. No, you don't. You have no idea. Now we're getting into the ego territory. Now you're getting into ego territory when you're making these assumptions. Well, they can't possibly mean something positive out of it. Why not? Well, because it hasn't happened in the past. Oh, now we go into victim mode. Do you see how everything we talk about sort of interlocks like a puzzle? And when you escalate this conflict, you're creating unnecessary trauma and drama within relationships. And I'm going to talk to you about when people make assumptions too, but this is specifically geared towards you, right? Because it's important that you are in your self-awareness because you want to be careful just because you assume somebody's intentions and then all of a sudden you kind of go off on them. You just escalated conflict based on an intention that you thought somebody had without verifying the intentions. Yeah, people can lie to you, but people can lie to you all day long. If you're going to worry about that, then you're never going to be around people. But typically, you got to kind of ask, what are the intentions? Back in the day, like years and years ago, when somebody would start dating somebody, they would ask the dad, hey, can I take your daughter out? Well, what are your intentions with my daughter? Like they would straight up and ask. Now, of course, they're not going to be like, well, I'd like to bang her out. Like they might not say that, but they're at least going to get the question asked. People have the ability to not respond honestly, because they're afraid of conflict. However, if you don't have conflict and you're being manipulative in it, now it creates its whole big problems. Now we have conflict escalation. It becomes a whole big thing. Now, cultural and social sort of influences play a big piece of assumption. I know you see that a lot with social media. You see that a lot with the 24-hour news coverage, right? Like when you have the cultural norms and society expectations, it's going to shape some of your assumptions. So you make assumptions without any appropriate behavior, beliefs, or like you just go, okay, well, socially, this is just how it is. Culturally, this is how it is. That goes into stereotyping, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But stereotyping is we're going to talk about that over on Patreon because that goes into a cognitive laziness. But, the big thing with stereotyping, you just assume, well, if you're this race, nationality, size, shape, gender, you must be this. And we see this so much in social society, in the world that we live in today. Oh, you'll see people are judged. They're judged based on gender. They're judged based on color. They're judged based on size, shape, form. That's not abnormal. It's been here since like the beginning of history, I'm assuming. Wasn't born there, but pretty sure, at least as far as the books go. And I think that's the biggest thing is you have to go against the grain of the social norms. Why are you trying to fit in? And you assume that if you do something opposite, then that's going to make it wrong. You assume this was so hard. Like mental health is so hard now, but it was even harder back in the day when people would they assumed that if you had depression or if you had anxiety or if you had such and such, you were just crazy. Like you just needed to be put literally back in the day. Didn't know how to handle it and they didn't want that embarrassment on them. So they just put you in an insane asylum. And meanwhile, you're just depressed. Like you're just depressed. but nobody wants to deal with it, right? Because social norm says, oh my God, don't pay somebody to talk about your problems. Why not? You're probably part of the problem. That's why I'm talking to somebody else. And yes, you do need to pay somebody to talk to, because they are there to hear you. They are there to call you on your stuff, and they are there to give you direction. You can't just say, I'm not going to spend money and I'm not going to invest in myself because it's money that I'm spending. But then you either hold it in or you go talk to the people who are part of the problem. Well, that's not going to solve the thing. So you want to be careful of those social norms, right? And you don't have to fall in line. You don't have to fit a box, and you don't have to. And you listen, there are going to be people who are going to distance from you if you are not doing what they want you to do. That's okay. Let them go. Let them go. Now, this one, I even did a whole podcast on this one. That's why I said cognitive laziness needs its own, and it's getting ready to have it today. But cognitive bias, oh my God, I did a whole podcast on this. Your cognitive bias, okay, says, I'm going to seek a not complex, that's the laziness. I am going to seek out information that confirms my existing beliefs. So this way, I know that it aligns with my assumptions, so I can have a preconceived notion. So if you're looking for negativity, you will find negativity. Oh my God, you see this so much in my practice and in the practice of psychology and everything else. People, don't like it to be their problem. They don't like it to be, oh, is it me? Am I the problem? It's me. Yeah, it could be. People don't want to hear that. So if somebody tells you that and you don't like the answer you hear, you're going to go get a second opinion. No problem. Now, the second opinion tells you the exact same thing in so many ways that the first opinion did. Now you need a third opinion. Okay, maybe that is even okay. Boom. Now we're at number 11. And if ran through 11 people and they're still telling you the same thing, and then that 12th person somehow or another aligns with you, you're going to be like, yeah, this is my person. No, it isn't. It might be, but it's doubtful. Because if somebody is agreeing with you and it's not benefiting you, right? You're just doing stuff because you have a cognitive bias by it, and it doesn't really benefit you in your relationships. And as somebody tells you and kind of calls you on it, that's good. But there are people who do not want to hear anything negative about themselves. They are not willing to be honest about it. So they will keep seeking other people until somebody aligns with them. You'll see this a lot on social media. You'll just scroll and you'll be like, oh, okay, you fit my narrative. Yes, in some ways, that's a great thing. Of course, you like minds are like minds. But it becomes problematic when you start looking for controversy and conspiracy theories and things like that. Yeah, that's something I don't have time for. So you'd be on your own on that one. But your confirmation bias is going to be something that you will seek and you will find it. I've said that multiple times. If I send your boyfriend a message because we have an appointment that he never told you about because it's not your business that he's working on himself, and you, for some odd reason, go through his phone, which is already a huge red flag, we'd have to discuss that relationship at large. But you see me tell him, okay, babe, can't see you at 2, I'll see you at 3. Okay, great, can't wait to see you. And now you automatically assume we are having an affair, and we are not. But your confirmation bias will tell and lie to yourself about anything that you see, and you're only going to pick it out. So when you're not willing to hear somebody else's perspective, and I don't mean, hey, we're coming up on big elections, which is the worst time. It's the worst year for me. Like I'm not into the politics. So you have to be mindful that your cognitive bias is creating a lot of the way that you see the world in general, right? If you see the world negative, you'll only see negative in the world. If you see the silver lining in the situation, then you'll be looking for the solutions. But what you see and think is how you're going to make your assumptions based on what you assume, based on your history, based on past, based on pattern recognition. But again, you're not in somebody's head. Don't tell somebody how they feel. Don't tell somebody why what they feel is wrong. Now, feelings aren't facts. And they can have their feelings, and it can be inaccurate, and that's fine. But you don't have to change their mind. But for yourself, stop seeking things that are just serving you in your confirmation bias. in order to grow, you must see things outside of yourself. It's one of the biggest things that I loved when I started practicing Buddhism is, you're just kind of open to everything. You're a sponge to everything, but you're attached to nothing. You learn something, you learn different people's perspective. I have clients all over the world. It's beautiful to talk to them because they do things different. They respond different, but at the core of life, we're all still those like same exact humans, right? In some ways. Now, cognitive laziness, I'm just going to tap on it here, but we have a whole podcast on it on the other side. And that's engaging with complex situations. And you are doing so without having all of the facts. You are doing so without taking the time. You are becoming responsive. And when you have the assumptions, it allows you to make these decisions quickly, even though they're inaccurate. So what happens is when you're going through that, right? And you're looking at a complex situation and you're like, oh God, there's got to be mental effort here. That can be too much. That can be overloaded. That could be sensory overload. That could be perception. That could be everything. But because of that, again, going back to the simplification in the beginning, you look for the path of least resistance, which is not always the most accurate path for you to take. And it's really, really important that you understand that. Like really important that you get that. And so again, I'm going to go deeper into the cognitive laziness because that's the opposite of critical thinking, and how critical thinking is actually like, that's so much amazingness in the world is if everybody in the world had critical thinking, but it's not always just like, oh, we just are supposed to have it. I mean, you got to work on it. As with anything else, it's just a muscle, right? Now, did you hear what I said when I said cognitive laziness, that it gives you an opportunity to respond to something fast? Because if you have to engage in a complex situation as your girl who has adult ADHD on a pretty severe level, I've learned really well to kind of work in my critical thinking to really help kind of balance out that, hey, I need to get there as fast as I can. I'm still working on it, But anytime that there's a fast-paced environment, you don't have the time to gather everything, you assume that you're going to make this decision. Well, I better make this decision now. Well, listen, we got to hurry up and book this trip. Do you want to go or not? I assume I'm going to have fun. Yeah, I'll go. And then an hour later, you're like, why did I say yes? I assume I'm not going to have fun. That's why your default answer can never be yes. No, it's not that deep. I mean, unless it's like life or death, but it's not that deep that you need to make that decision right this second. I don't care what they want. You give them a minute, give them a time. Hey, let me check. Let me see what's going on. Give me till 5 o'clock and I'll get back to you. Like, go ahead and give them that same day turnaround, but do not use these time constraints and assume that if you don't go, they're going to be mad. Assume if you do go, you're going to have a great time. You don't know what's going to happen. So before you start assuming and trying to catalog and trying to play scenarios in your head, a lot of times you're just like, yeah, assume I'm going to have fun. That sounds great. Aruba? Yeah, I'm there. But then you realize 3 hours later, 3 people are coming on that you don't really vibe with. And you're like, oh my God, I'm going to be in a whole different country with these people that I cannot stand. Well, you said yes from the get without waiting and saying who all's going to be there, which by the way, should always be a default answer. Hey, do you want to come to this barbecue? I'm not sure what I'm doing, but who all's going to be there? Yeah, you have a right to say that. So now that you've done that and you made the assumption that it was going to be fun and it was just going to be the two of you because you didn't ask any questions, now your feelings are hurt because you assumed it was just going to be you guys and you assumed incorrectly. And so that's one of the big things. Now, of course, one of my favorite things is the uncertainty and the unknown. I used to despise it. I absolutely adore it and love it now. But so many people struggle with uncertainty and not knowing, right? And yes, it's supposed to be uncomfortable. It's going to be uncomfortable. So you make these assumptions, and this way in your mind, you're predicting. This is where you see, well, I mean, I don't know if it's going to work, but historically, now we're going pattern recognition, but we're also going a little cognitive bias and a little simplification. And you're like, well, I mean, yeah, well, the last time my relationship was going great until it wasn't. So I just assume that, you know what, this is going to go good till it isn't. So now you tell yourself, instead of saying, well, I'm just going to go with the flow and see where it goes, your brain goes, I don't know. It's a little scary. It's uncertain there. You don't have control there. Yeah, that's right. You don't have control there. Facts. So let's just assume that this is how it's going to be. Again, you cannot assume somebody's intentions, positive nor negative. A lot of it is conscious and a lot of it is subconscious. So you got to keep that in mind, And so when you're in that, you have to understand your ego is going to kick in high gear. Okay. Admitting that you don't know something is a superpower. It is not a weakness. I need you to hear this. Admitting, hey, do you have the answer to this? No, I don't. But if you give me an hour or two, let me look it up and I'll try to get back to you. If you give me till next week, I'll get back to you. It is perfectly fine to not know. And quite honestly, I would rather work with somebody who has no clue and then comes back after they've done the research. I'm here for it. Don't tell me you got the answer. Don't tell me that, oh, well, if I look like I can't do something, I'm incompetent. Well, then handle your stuff. Handle your stuff. That's your old ego. That is your old trauma. Handle your stuff. Guess what? You don't know everything. Nobody knows everything. Nobody on this entire planet that we live in now, back then, or in the future is going to know every single thing on this planet. Right? And when you don't know something, it challenges your ego. Good, as it's supposed to. So then when you assume it, you're just going to be confident. Well, I know what I'm doing. This also goes into problematic ego when you assume that you're right. So then you start Googling things to prove somehow in your head that you're right about something somebody told you that you didn't necessarily know or think was true. So you Googled it, but then you found out that they were actually right and you were wrong. And then you're like, oh, okay. And you won't say anything. But if in fact you were right in your mind, then you want to show and prove for what reason? That's ego. Your assumptions based in ego is going to be problematic. It is not protecting you. Okay. Now, the last one is kind of like, you could see how certain assumptions could be made. Just be mindful. If there's a communication barrier, okay, if it's a language barrier, different communication styles, because some people are more direct, some people are more passive, not in a passive aggressive way, just more passive. And that's okay. Like, it's fine. Anything like that is going to create some misunderstandings. So this is where, if you have to pull out, let's say it's a language barrier, you pull out something that you can ask the question and get clarification on. Just because there's a different language being spoken doesn't mean that you have the right to just assume that you know what it is that they're trying to say. So what are all of these assumptions continue to cause problems with? Well, unrealistic expectations for one. Assumptions and expectations, like I said, go pretty much hand in hand. So if you're assuming that others share your perspective, okay, without verifying it, look, this is what I assumed this way. I assumed you would do this. I assume you would do this because I would do this. Well, why would you do that, Mr. Ego person? That's your ego. People live life differently. They respond differently. They react differently. It doesn't make them wrong. Some people respond to a text right away. Other people, like myself, may not. It doesn't make anybody wrong. Okay? And it's so, so important because these unrealistic expectations, it's like, well, my expectations weren't being met. And I assumed that this person would say yes, or I assumed that this person would say no, or I assumed that this person would do this. You see this a lot when people have children, and then it's like their parent or their siblings or something like that. They get their feelings all hurt because they're like, oh yeah, no, I'm not watching the kids for you tonight. I'm going out. I'm going to sit home and watch Netflix. Oh, well, I just kind of, in your mind, you're like, I just kind of assumed that she would say yes. She always says yes. I assumed that. Now you're mad. Now you've done made plans without asking ahead of time. That was your own issue. And you assumed as such. And your assumptions are going to create high expectations that and when I say high expectations, I do not mean that in a good way. I meant unrealistic expectations. And that's going to become problematic for you. Okay. Now, talking about the cultural differences, right? You got to be sensitive to other cultures, right? But you have to understand that not everybody is going to believe spiritually, economically, financially. Everybody believes things differently, and that is A-okay. Just because they worship something different or they believe something different does not give you a space to judge and assume that what you feel is the right way. This is the problem I have. Go back and listen to the podcast on religious trauma. It's the problem I have with like organized religion. That's why I practice Buddhism, because it's not a religion, it's a way of life. But I grew up Southern Baptist, and it is very much like it's my way, even though they try to use it from the Bible, but it's always skewed to, well, this is right for us, and this is wrong for everybody else. And you got to remember that those assumptions are highly rooted in ego and insecurity of any nature. Of any nature. What you believe in, if that is right for you, then by all means, my God, yes, love that. Just don't judge somebody else culturally, socially, because they rock with something different than you. That's great. That's what makes the world go around in which we live in. Okay? Now, you will also miss out on opportunities. If you assume that you know everything about a situation, well, you're not going to grow. You're not going to learn anything. You're definitely not going to collaborate because nobody wants a know-it-all, right? You have to be open to new perspectives. Just because you're doing something inaccurate, that's fine. I mean, just because they're doing something that you feel is inaccurate, that's fine. Just because you're doing something that other people might look at as inaccurate, that's fine. Yes, communication, having a communication conversation is important, but don't just sit there. You're going to miss out on opportunities because you think that you got to have it all together. Your ego has to take over. You assume that if you don't know, you're weak. That is not the case. I just said that to you. And you will miss out on growing. You will miss out on all of those things, especially, now that's growth in general. I mean, missed opportunities. And then there's growth, right? You're going to have limited personal growth. When you're assuming that you're always right, or you're closed off to how other people worship, how other people vote, how other people do this, you don't have to love it. You don't have to agree with it. But if you cannot, like I carry on in conversations with so many people who practice so many different religions, so many different ways of life, faith, and everything else, I love talking to them. I may not buy into everything, and I'm okay with that. And they may not buy into everything, and that's okay. But we have the emotional intelligence to have that conversation. Right? If you can't accept that your assumptions are going to probably often be wrong, then it's going to help you engage in a different way of approach. But if you just assume that how you think somebody feels, says, does is right or wrong or whatever, you're going to find yourself very isolated. I mean, that's just a fact. Okay, so you got to keep that in mind. And then there's something called undermining trust, right? And you got to remember that when you make incorrect assumptions, people are not going to trust you all that much. When they start seeing you being negative, you start accusing people of things that, you start assuming that something's going to be that way. They're going to be very hesitant to confide in you. Oh, yeah. Because people don't want to be misunderstood and judged by you. There's a reason why people distance from people who are judgy, because nobody wants to be around somebody who's judgy. I do not judge a human being. I observe a situation, I analyze it and say, does this action or person's actions and behavior, does it align with what I want around me? Yes, great. No, great. I'm not going to judge you as Bob the person. Bob the person is a person. They're flawed. That's okay. Does Bob the person's actions align with me? No. Okay, that's fine. I don't have to rock with it. But I'm not going to sit and judge it. And because of that, people will end up talking to me about things. People who wouldn't normally have a conversation with people, because I'm not going to judge you, right? Now, the assumptions can also really screw up your decision-making. Oh God, you can have decision-making errors left and right. See, making decisions based on assumptions rather than the facts can lead to very poor choices. Well, if I don't do this, they're not going to like me. If I do this, they'll love me more. Based on what? Based on what fact? Well, because I want it. That's not a fact. But I feel not a fact. Thoughts and feelings are not facts. They will never be facts. Well, I mean, but there is no but to that. It's literally that easy. Yeah, black and white thinking, not always great because that goes into your cognitive laziness. But yes, 100%, you will make poor decisions when you don't know how somebody else is feeling. And you're not going to know that by just assuming because you looked at a tweet and you had a conversation for 35 seconds and you never addressed the elephant in the room. Well, guess what? You're going to find that your decision making and efforts that you make might be very, very inaccurate in the long run. And I can tell you one thing that it will absolutely do. It will isolate and alienate you. No one wants to be around someone who's judging them 24/7. So what does this mean for you if someone is making assumptions over you? Let them. You just address it. You create a clear boundary, right? I said this in a short form video about complaining. You can address it head on. Hey, if there's something you think that I could do about that situation personally, please bring it to me and I'll see if it's something that I can engage with. That's fine. However, if you are going to come to me and complain about anything else, I'm not available for it. See, your boundaries don't have to be warm and fuzzy. Theirs don't have to be warm and fuzzy. And when you're not in a good headspace, you're going to take it as aggression. You're going to take it as, betrayal. It's not. Remember that boundaries are specifically for that person. It's not a personal attack. It is not a personal attack. I feel like you need to hear that over and over again. But when somebody always has, if you feel like, well, I know what you were thinking. How? Were you in my brain? Well, no, but I know. No, you don't know. You have no idea. You assume consciously and subconsciously. So when other people are making assumptions, you don't have to go and try to twist it and turn it and prove how right you are and prove how much you know. You don't have to do all that. Because their assumptions aren't going to necessarily change. Because people are highly driven by ego, which is why you got to put that ego to death. You're still going to walk with your ego, but the not so happy part of it is like ego death series. It's there for a reason. So you got to check yourself and say, do I assume that because my mom, after you had the kids, my mom said through the whole pregnancy how much she just can't wait to spend time with the grandbaby? Well, that does not mean you assume that every single time you want to go out and do something, she's going to be there to pick up the pieces. That also goes into entitlement. Hey, Mom, do you think that you can watch Haley? Oh, no, I can't watch her this weekend. Oh, well, I already made plans. Well, you're going to have to change them. Like that was on you. You assumed that she said she wanted to watch grandkids as much as she can. So you just assumed that it was going to be that way. So you assumed that you could make the plans, and then you're mad at her because you made plans without asking. And then you assumed that it was going to be yes. Well, now you got to check yourself. Now that goes into entitlement. So I want you to be very, very clear, and I want you to be mindful when you're making the assumptions, but I promise you cognitive laziness is a big one that causes assumptions. And we're going to head over there in just a second and talk about it. But I want you to be very, very clear that you can't assume you know what somebody's intentions are. You can't assume you know what somebody's thinking and feeling. And you can't assume that what they're feeling is wrong or inaccurate. You're not looking for a common ground. You're looking to be right. And no one owes you anything. No one's coming for you. Nobody owes you anything. And vice versa. But what you don't want, I think is fair to say, is you don't want miscommunication and misunderstanding, inaccurate judgments, conflict escalation. How much fun does this seem like to you? Unrealistic expectations. That's the one that's getting you. That's that one, and the cognitive laziness and bias, that's getting you. That's keeping you, that's holding you up. So don't just assume that you know somebody's going to say yes or no. Don't just assume you know how somebody's feeling. Don't just assume that you know what somebody's intentions are. Don't assume that because they said no with no follow-up that they're mad at you. Based on what? Because they didn't give you a follow-up? Because that's their boundary. So I want you to be aware of that, because we can't become better human beings for ourselves and for the people around us until we have that self-awareness. So this, again, is never to shame you. It's never to blame you, but it is to bring awareness. Because if you're not aware of your behaviors and the areas that you need to grow in, you'll just say the words. You'll say the words that sound good. You'll say the things, and I hear you, but you got to, if you're going to talk about it, you better be about it. So you want to make sure that when you find yourself assuming, check yourself real quick. It's not going to be overnight, but check yourself and say, hey, wasn't exactly sure what you meant by that. Can you please clarify? Because if not, you're going to do that assumption game where you start spinning out in your head. You start making out storylines. You start obsessively thinking. You start trying to figure out what they're thinking and what they're doing and why they didn't do this and why that. Well, you could alleviate that if you just ask somebody. Yeah, they could lie to you, but you also may not like the answer you get. They might say, I just don't want to. You got to be willing to take that. So I want you to get clear in that, because I promise you, I don't assume anything. I will ask. I'll be like, hey, can I get blah, blah, blah? Or can I use blah, blah, blah? If you say no, it's no. I don't assume that I have that. So I want you to be mindful of it. I want you to work on your assumptions. I want you to be honest about them, but I don't want you to judge them. Because when you can let go of assumptions, you can have such a better relationship with yourself and everybody else around you. Check it out.